Now, we're going to talk about K-12 education. Is that right, David? Thank you. There's a similar revolution that's going to happen, I think, in K-12 education. And I want to put this into a Vermont perspective for you. This is a state, as the Commissioner of Education will tell you, that has 67, 72 high schools, something like that. Okay? 600,000 people in this state, 230 school districts, all insisting on local control. Okay? And we are the recipients of the product of those schools. Let me put it in statistical terms. 62% of all of the high school graduates who go on to college in Vermont come to our colleges. Okay? This is where Vermonters go to college. We need to be very, very aligned with what's going to come out of our schools. The Common Core standards have been developed with a small amount of post-secondary input. That's not because that input wasn't invited, it's because it was resisted. And furthermore, the students, how many of you are involved in teacher preparation in this state? Okay? The students who come in your door this fall and hopefully graduate in 4 years as teachers in Vermont are going to go into a very different educational environment. And we need to be sure that we're keeping current with that and participating in that. So I'm really thrilled that we have our afternoon speaker today, so let me introduce him. Vermont's transition to the Common Core state standards will require the full participation of higher education. True. Our next speaker, David Liben, has been a faculty member and administrator in all levels of education, from elementary through college, and his wide experience in the kind of commitment and innovation that's necessary to make this transition successfully. In partnership with his wife and business partner, Meredith, he is working with Vermont school districts and educators on how to teach students to learn independently from complex text. Coupled with his teaching coupled with his teaching of history and psychology at CCV, David has a unique perspective on what we as Vermont educators can do to help students achieve much more under the Common Core standards. So before I ask David to come up, one last thing on this. If K-12 education succeeds in the ways that I hope it will in transforming itself, we need to be sure that we're providing the next step in their educational evolution when they come to our doors. If they come from individualized, project-oriented, competency-based education and come into a 19th century educational setting, we're not going to serve our mission at all well. So I'm delighted to have David Liben and Meredith, great to see you both, with us today. David's a New York Yankees fan, just so you know. Meredith's a Red Sox fan, so you know. Kind of. Okay. I've known them for a great many years, and I'm delighted to have them with us. Introduce David Liben.
Thank you, Tim. That's probably the nicest introduction I've ever gotten from a Red Sox fan. Although you might have been happy to see in the papers today that there's rumors that the evil empire will be put on the market for sale. All right. You probably can tell by the first few sentences of my presentation that I'm not from Vermont. I'm from Brooklyn and the Bronx. I grew up in Brooklyn. I moved to the Bronx so that I could bicycle to Yankee Stadium, and that's where I lived until we came to Vermont, where Meredith grew up in the Upper Valley. For today, what I'd like to do, we've been going around the country talking to, it may border on tens of thousands of teachers now, K-12 teachers, about the Common Core. To avoid death by PowerPoint, the best way is to have not 114 PowerPoint slides, I think we have about a dozen, but the other is to take questions throughout the presentation. So we really encourage, as we go along, for you to ask questions. If there's something that's not clear, better yet, if there's something you don't agree with, raise your hand, please. Meredith is going to have the mic. She'll bring it around because we are being taped. And ask those questions because they make these presentations much more meaningful and much more educational. So please keep that in mind. Questions are good. All right. Any questions? All right. So we're okay. Let's go on to the history of the Common Core standards. The federal government, as you probably know, has no legislative jurisdiction over education in the United States. It's an implied power. It's left to the states. They only can coerce, mandate. They can't really mandate. They can only coerce or get the states to do anything if they say, well, we won't give you money if you don't do this. We won't give you your Title I money, Title II money, Title whatever money. It's an interesting question, and that I think about a lot. You know, every state has in its constitution that the children in that state have a right to some kind of basic education or basic quality education. New Hampshire has been wrestling with this for about 14 years to try to come up with a way to change the Constitution so that they don't have to spend so much money for whatever the basic education that the kids are supposed to get will get. In 1973, in Rodriguez versus San Antonio School District, the Supreme Court ruled 5-4 that the right to an equal educational opportunity is not in the Constitution. So it was only one vote difference. Had one vote on whoever was in the court at that time changed, then the federal government would have the right to look into every school, every district in the country, make the Tea Party completely crazy, to see if children are in fact getting equal educational opportunity. But because of that one vote in that one case, they don't get that. So as far as the history of the Common Core state standards, it grew out of No Child Left Behind, sometimes affectionately known as Nickleby, George Bush's signature, really his signature domestic initiative. You may remember on September 11th when the towers went down, he was reading out loud in a class somewhere in the country. What Nickleby did was it said that, No Child Left Behind, Nickleby, it said that every child in the United States is to be a proficient in math and reading by 2014. However, what is deemed proficient we will leave up to each state to determine what proficiency is. So in both math and in reading, and we're going to talk mostly about literacy today, or English language arts, reading and writing. Just a tiny bit about math, because that's ELA is our area. In No Child Left Behind, the idea was that each state would create their own standards to determine what is a proficient reader, what is a proficient writer, what is a proficient math student. Each state could make their own standards. If students didn't meet those standards, there would be some consequence to the state. They would lose some money, schools might have to close, principals might have to leave, and there would be all these kinds of consequences, which sometimes actually trickle down and happen. And right here in Burlington, Vermont, a principal of a very nice school had to leave because of that legislation. But again, each state made its own standards. And then each state could make its own test to determine proficiency. And then each state could make its own what they call a cut score. Is 60% proficient? Is 80% right proficient? Is 24% right proficient? So the states were given this mandate to be proficient. They were told there would be consequences if they weren't proficient. But then they were told they make the standards, they make the test, and they make the cut scores. Well, this is not just like letting the foxes into the hen house. This is giving the foxes a GPS and some roadsides along the way. Because what happened was entirely predictable. And some people said this would happen. The states either dumbed down the standards for what proficient is, dumbed down the test itself, when Meredith and I did analysis of 1,350 state test items, we saw some passages that in some states were used in 6th grade, and in other states, on the reading test, and in other states, the same passages were used in 4th grade. So the states had the opportunity to dumb down the standards, dumb down the cut scores. On reading tests, they could dumb down the passages. And it soon became clear that that's what was doing. When the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is what we have for a national test, it's not given to every school, but it's given to a random sample enough to be statistically valid, there were these huge gaps. You got certain states where 88% of the kids were proficient readers, but when they took the National Assessment of Educational Progress, 23% were proficient. Vermont and Massachusetts had the smallest gap, by the way, almost every year. But in most states, there was this huge gap. So it really wasn't working very well. And the National Governors Association and the Chief Council of School State Officers got together and said, well, look, what can we do? How can we change this? We can't make standards that are the same for everyone, for every state, because it's unconstitutional. But what if we made standards that were voluntary? We don't call it national, we call it common core. States can choose to adopt those standards, or states can choose not to adopt those standards. And then inside the country, there'll be one set of standards, or at least for as many states that adopt it. And if there's one set of standards, there'll likely be one test. It turns out, in reality, we're going to have two tests created by two testing consortia that roughly equal amounts of states will sign up for. That makes it much harder. You can't dumb down the standards because the standards will be made, these common core. You can't dumb down the test because it's a little harder to dumb down the test and the cut score when you have 23 or 24 states with each test and each cut score. So the Common Core Standards idea was born out of the National Governors Association and the Council of Chief State School Officers. You needed somebody to make these standards. Usually, the way standards are made within a state, the state education department gets people from all over the state, from every grade level, and you might have 30 or 40 or 50 people talking about what should be the standards for reading, for math, for writing. And you get differences and you get debate. And this person wants this person wants that, and this person wants that. How do you think they usually resolve that? Committee? Thumb wrestling? That was New Hampshire. Something altogether different. What'd you say in the back? Put them all in there. Right. Everybody gets what they want. Make everybody happy. You like this idea, you like this idea, you like that idea, and you get, and our state standards were somewhat close to this, you get sometimes 130 standards that need to be met just for reading and writing in kindergarten. That means that's like, I think, 1.6 standards a day or 0.7 standards a day are going to be achieved in kindergarten. And that's usually the way the standards are made. With the Common Core standards, what the National Governors Association and Chief Council of State School Officers did is they had to find someone to write the standards. They went to Achieve. Achieve is a national nonprofit organization that has always been the educational arm of the National Governors Association. If you're familiar with the American Diploma Project, they created that, and a few others. And so Achieve had to find somebody to write the standards. And they ended up choosing three primary writers for the ELA standards and three primary writers for the math standards. For the ELA standards, they chose David Coleman, a name you might recognize as the primary architect of the ELA standards, Sue Pimentel, who's worked with the Chief for a long time, and Jim Patterson, who was working with the American College Testing Service. And I don't know the names of all the math people, but I know the one who did the primary K-8 math standards was right here from Vermont. Was a professor of physics at Bennington College, Jason Zimba. Sue Pimentel actually lives in the Upper Valley in Hanover. So our little portion of the country actually had quite a bit to do with standards. David Coleman was the lead writer of the reading standards, And we knew David Coleman because when he went to Yale, was, I believe, a philosophy major, and then was a Rhodes Scholar at Cambridge and got a degree in poetry, which he often refers to as likely the most useless degree one could acquire. And after that, was a consultant with McKinsey Consulting Company, a super consulting company in New York. The consulting company always works with the Department of Education of the city. And when David was working with the Department of Education of the City of New York, they asked him to go find some schools that were serving low-income kids exclusively and were doing very well on all the tests, on the reading and writing test in this instance. And David Coleman came to Meredith and my school that we started in around 1991 and spent a couple of days, well, one day, he spent one day in our apartment going over everything we do, and one day at the school. And we worked with him, and we've worked with him over the years. And when the standards came, when he got the assignment to write the standards, we were in Vermont. In fact, I remember the call. I was driving to a school I was working with in Manchester, and I got this phone call. I pull over, because it was one of the few places that I get reception, so I figured I might as well pull over. And he told me that they got the job to write these standards that will be Common Core for the whole country, and he really wants Meredith and myself to work with them, and also to run a research project about text complexity, we'll talk about in a minute. And on the same day, a friend of ours, who's a librarian who worked with us in our school, got a call while he was walking on the beach with his daughter in the state of Washington to put together Appendix B. Appendix B is very interesting. It's the list of books and selections that are examples of what is appropriate type of reading for each grade, from kindergarten to 12th grade. It's an appendix in the standard. And he put that together. So it was kind of like, the way my friend called it, it was kind of like one of those movies where the retired CIA agent gets an emergency call from someone to come back into the office for some reason. And that's how we got involved in writing the standards, which we were involved with from the very beginning, and in writing them, and also in the research project that we'll mention. So that's the history of the Common Core state standards. So that's why every child, they've been adopted by 46 states. Alaska did not adopt it, but Anchorage, Alaska, which is where 90% of the children are, did adopt it. Texas, of course, didn't adopt it. And Virginia didn't adopt it. But they may be seceding soon anyway. But anyway, those two states didn't adopt, and I think one of the Dakotas didn't adopt. But other than that, we have 46 states have adopted the Common Core state standards, and the District of Columbia, and Anchorage, Alaska. And that's a huge, huge shift for the United States of America. It's a decentralized education system. It has been. And now, how we determine what a good reader is, and a good writer, and a good math student, and it's now moving into science. It's called Next Generation Science Standards, which have been tentatively adopted by 26 states. Science will be a little trickier because of evolution. There's a lot of states that no, I don't want to hear anything about it, we're not adopting. So science will be a little bit trickier, and I don't think there'll ever be history standards in our country. After all, what was it? Texas denied Thomas Jefferson founding father status because they thought he was a deist. So I don't think we're going to ever have history standards, but I think it's quite a dramatic change that we've got common standards for 46 states and the District of Columbia and Anchorage in the United States of America. Okay, before I go on next, any questions or thoughts about that? Yes. The question was, why two test systems? It's a really good question. It's an enormous amount of, you've probably heard about all the politics and controversy that goes around state tests, and now you're going to have one test for every child in the United States of America. That's giving a lot of power to that one group. It's still a lot of power to two, but it's a little bit diluted, number one. And number two, you can compare and contrast, because they're approaching it, for the most part, radically different than past tests. For example, it's not going to be all multiple choice. One of the things they're doing, because we're going to talk about this, the Common Core standards have a huge emphasis on evidence, evidence, evidence. If you answer a question, where in the text is your evidence? So one of the things they're working towards is how can you build that into a test, because that's difficult to do with multiple choice. So since they're going to all be online tests, kids are going to actually take their mouse, and this is after third grade and up, and highlight the evidence for their answers. So they're going to be comparing the two different tests. So the two reasons are to compare and to dilute the power a little bit. Good question. Any other questions? Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please. The structure of the standards. There's 4 standards: reading, writing, speaking, and listening. The anchor standards were created first. The anchor standards are the standards for college and career, which we're going to show you. And then they worked backwards from those standards. Grade level standards built out from the anchors of college and career readiness. So it was reverse engineered. So we looked at what does someone who's got to be ready for college and career need to be able to do with their reading. And then we reversed back all the way to kindergarten, from 12th grade to kindergarten. That was by far the most difficult thing to do with the creation of the standards. Explicit standards exist for content area literacy. For too long, reading and writing in science, reading and writing in social studies has not been of any concern to most people. There are now standards that apply to science, social studies, and technical subjects for the first time. And the standards are listed by grade bands. So like 6 to 8, 9 to 10, 11 to 12. So let's take a look at the anchor standards. Give you a good question. There are 10 of them, and these are the anchor standards for reading. And they encompass literary text and informational text. Read closely to determine what the text says explicitly and make logical inferences from it. Cite specific textual evidence when writing or speaking to support conclusions drawn from the text. That's called the evidence text. Text number 1, the evidence text. Or the evidence standard, thank you. Number 2, central ideas or themes of a text. Analyze their development. Summarize the key supporting details and ideas. That's sometimes called the main idea text. Main idea standard. 3, how and why individuals, events, and ideas develop and interact over the course of a text. The interaction standard. Standard 4, you can take a look at that because you may be hearing enough of my voice. And that's the vocabulary standard. Standard 5, the structure of text, including how specific sentences, paragraphs, and larger portions of the text relate to each other and the whole. That's the structure standard. Standard 6 is the point of view or purpose standard, how point of view or purpose shapes the content and style of a text. 7, integrate and evaluate content presented in diverse media and formats, including visually and quantitatively as well as in words. That's the multimedia standard. Standard 8, the argument standard. Delineate and evaluate the argument and specific claims in a text, including the validity of the reasoning, as well as the relevance and sufficiency of the evidence. So that's the argument standard. Standard 9, analyze how 2 or more texts address similar themes or topics in order to build knowledge or to compare the approaches the author takes. That's the multi-text standard. And 10, read and comprehend complex literary and informational texts independently and proficiently. That's the complex text standard. Standard 10 is very different. It's the only time any standard, of all the standards that have been in the States in our country, has required a certain level of text complexity. You can no longer, for example, analyze 2 or more texts to how similar the themes or topics are in the 8th grade, and those 2 texts are 5th grade texts. You're not meeting the standard. The change, and this is a huge change, the change means that to meet any of these standards, if you're an 8th grader or a 4th grader, you have to read 8th grade texts that have been determined to be 8th grade complexity, or if you're in the 4th grade texts that have been determined to be 4th grade complexity. We have a lot of kids who can't read text at current levels of complexity. But now they're going to be asked to read texts at greater levels of complexity. And that's standard 10, the complexity standard. And we'll come back to that. So these are the anchor standards. Let's take a look at how they flush out going from grade level to grade level. This is standard 1 in grades 6 to 12, which is the evidence standard. In the 6th grade, cite textual evidence to support analysis of what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences drawn from the text. Now, if you look at the same standard for grade 7, it increases in rigor by you have to cite several pieces of textual evidence for the same thing, what the text says explicitly and inferences. Then when you go to grade 8, cite the textual evidence that most strongly supports an analysis of what the text says explicitly, etc. So you're going from just citing textual evidence in 6th grade, citing several pieces of textual evidence in 7th grade, citing the textual evidence that most strongly supports the analysis in 8th grade. But in 8th grade, you're still expected to be able to do what is asked of you in 6th and 7th grade. You're still expected to master those earlier standards, or have mastered them. Grades 9 and 10 cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support the analysis of what the text says. So this means that in the 9th and 10th grade, any piece of evidence that is in a text, students are expected to be able to find and use all the evidence in a text, or certainly a thorough use of the evidence. Grades 11 and 12 cite strong and thorough textual evidence to support what the text says explicitly, as well as inferences, including determining where the text leaves matters uncertain. So in each standard, you go up a little bit in terms of complexity for each standard, or in terms of rigor. You start with the anchor standard, and you reverse engineer back from kindergarten to 12th grade. I'm only showing you 6th to 12th grade. That was a difficult process to do, but that's how these standards were made.
There's so much emphasis on text interpretation and complexity of text and all that in the Common Core. And I recall a statement as the Common Core is being developed about multimedia, digital media, and the statement, they didn't say these words, but basically not ready for prime time. We're putting emphasis on text. And I'm thinking about our speaker first thing this morning, so much emphasis on digital technologies and all the various ways information might be transmitted. I wonder if you could talk about that tension.
The tension you picked up was definitely there. We put our emphasis on the text. We did not put our, to be as frank as I can, we did not put our emphasis on multimedia, but it produced a political uproar, so we made a multimedia standard. I think it's a good solution. It's a standard. It's as important, with the exception of standard 1 and 10, it's as important as any other standard. What the Common Core standards say very clearly, however, is that non-print media cannot replace print media. The use of computer programs, videos, any type of media should enhance the text as opposed to replace the text. So in other words, if you're learning about the failure of Reconstruction, you can't just learn it through Ken Burns' video. You have to have a text, and you have to use Ken Burns' video to enhance the ability to read the text. So I think politically it was a compromise of sorts, but I think it was a good compromise. And I think, I kind of left out how, a large part of how these standards were written. You have 6 or 7 or 8 people who have their hands on the pen. That's true. But then it goes up into all kinds of organizations. It goes to the International Reading Association, the National Council of Teachers of English. It did go to some higher ed groups. I don't remember which ones, but it did go to higher ed groups. And it went to the Modern Language Association. It goes to just about, the only association that didn't weigh in was the NFL Players Association. And that's because they were on strike. So many people had a chance to say, look, we don't like this, and here's why. And there was a validating committee of teachers, professors of literacy in higher education institutes that had about 100 people on it. It had about 100 people on it that gave final approval. So though it was a small number of people who were actually putting their pens on the paper, it got approved by many, many people, and it was quite a sifting and winnowing political process, and that's why the multimedia standard is there. It's a good question. Mary?
And two more clarifying. There was everything we say about ELA or literacy, there's a parallel process for math. It's just we tend to the ELA side. So NCTM, science associations, everybody weighed in on the math side. And when we say text, we mean text in any form. We're not talking about paper, text printed on paper. So, but the weight of the standards is definitely on words and reading and thinking analytically about text and however it appears.
And it's interesting that the math, we have another question?
Well, your last answer is why it has an asterisk in the anchor standard.
Yes, that's right. Did you know that, or did you infer that?
No, I was wondering why it had the asterisk, but I guess that.
Yep, good pickup. Interestingly, the math standards produced more controversy. Well, I'll talk about that when I put on the math shifts. Anything else on, any other questions or comments? Yes.
Are there additional standards for writing separately, or is that kind of part of this?
There's writing standards, speaking standards, listening standards, and reading standards.
Oh, so we're just looking at reading.
Yeah, we're looking at reading as an example, and we're looking at the anchor standards. Tim's got it.
So I'm assuming, and you may get to this a little later, but I'm assuming that the hope here is that we, as the next stage in these students' education, can build on the anchor standard.
Yes.
This is what we should assume is coming in the door, and we should align with that as the starting point.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And as you said, we go into it a little more depth later on. But I think it's a great thing for everybody who's teaching, especially freshmen coming into their classes, to take a look at the anchor standards or the 11th and 12th grade standards. These are what kids are expected to do. This is what they'll be tested on. And to look at that, to internalize that to some extent and build on it makes complete sense. I think there was another question.
Right here. So I'm a guest here today. I'm a middle school language arts and social studies teacher. Within 2 years in our building, we're going to be completely Common Core with report cards. So we're throwing out grading A, B, C, D, or F. We're not going to have a rating scale from 100 to 70 as passing at our school. It's going to be graded 1, 2, 3, or 4 based on how well you do in the standards. So that's maybe where you're going to be looking. If it's starting at middle school, working its way up the high school ladder, you might be seeing Common Core grades that you're going to have to evaluate to determine who's going to be coming to college or not.
Right. That's it. And there's a number of schools are doing that. It'll be interesting to see how it works. It's not going to be that easy a transition for the teachers, the kids, or anything. Yes? Short questions are good. Long questions are good.
My question is regarding the students who are not deemed proficient. What happens to those students?
That's a good question. It's still up to each state to deal with, although the score of what is proficient will not be made by each state. That will be made by the testing consortia from 23, 24 states. Each state still makes their own decision. What do they do with kids who are not proficient? And it's a good question. And each state also, for severely disabled children, children who have severe disabilities in language, each state has the option of deciding how their alternative test is made, just like it exists now. So some things don't change. This is a big enough change. Any other questions? Usually I don't order my wife around like this at all. This is very unusual.
Currently, I would guess that maybe half of my sophomores and juniors in my classes would maybe meet grade 8 standard now. Can we now assume that over the next 3 or 4 years that's going to change dramatically because of this?
I assume you're talking about your sophomores and juniors in college, right? Yes. Can we assume that that's going to change? Well, I addressed this at the end, but certainly the effort is going to be made to change that. Really, your question is, will it work? I get to that at the end.
And the tests don't kick in until the 14-15 school year. So students currently in 9th grade and high school will never be tested on these standards. So I'd say 4 to 6 years would be the window to start seeing change.
Another question? All right, let's take a look at math briefly. Meredith and I have not worked on the math standards, but I think it's important to give you the soul of the math standards. How many math teachers do we have here? Oh, a lot. All right. You may be familiar with research that goes back to, I forget the name, in the 1980s when they first started looking carefully at the math programs in some of the Asian countries. And the general gist was they cover much less than we do. That our math standards are a mile wide and an inch deep compared to the math standards. And I can see by the nodding of your heads that you're aware of that. The goal of these new math standards was to abolish that as much as possible. And it caused more controversy than the ELA standards because California almost didn't adopt because there are a lot of people who figure that if your kids are not taking algebra by the 8th grade, then you're a failure and you're going to go to hell. And so it produced this enormous conflict over whether or not they get algebra in the 8th grade. The gist of these standards was kids need to have, first of all, they have to be fluent, not just in the times table, but 106 times 7 should not involve a calculator. They need to be able to fluently work with numbers with ease. There needs to be coherence. You can't start every year by reviewing for 4 months what came before. There has to be a coherent sequence that focuses on what the standards focus on. So you have coherence, you have fluency, and you have, instead of an either-or, the math world, just like the ELA world, is constantly divided over rote learning or fluency versus deep understanding. You need both. You need to be fluent comfortably with numbers, and you need to have a deep understanding. So these standards, the shift that they're making in math is for a deeper understanding of math and fluency, and for those two not to be conflicting goals in our mathematical pedagogy. And I urge you, if you want to know more, they're really well laid out in the Common Core standards. Meredith?
And the website for these, because we are only tip of the iceberg in an hour and a half, is corestandards.org is where they sit. So the website is corestandards.org for all the math and all the ELA, even though we chose to focus primarily on the reading standards as we talked today. So that's where they all sit. There's even an app if you would like it.
Okay. Questions on the math shifts?
Yes, I teach computer science here at Vermont Tech, and I've glanced through Appendix B, the math appendix, and I've Googled some terms so I can see what some of the people are saying about the math. And there's a notable lack, apparently, of any emphasis or even mention of algorithmic thinking and algorithmic skills, which is the basis not only of computer science, but a lot of what runs the world today. When I Googled, I was using algorithms. It seems like there's a really big gap or a really big missing piece in that could have been put in mathematics or could have been put into in some other area, but it's not there, and it should be.
All right, I can answer that very simply. I don't know. We did not work on the math standards. We understand this idea, but you ask a very profound question. I could make a guess, but I'd rather not even guess. What I can say is that, since I'm ignorant about it, if you email me, I will get the writer of the standards to respond. Yes?
It's obviously a critical question, but there is a cadre out there on all sorts of levels. They're not quite organized yet, but one of the things under discussion, heavily under discussion, we have grown up with reading, writing, and arithmetic, as it were.
Right.
for our standards. There is a large number of people out there who want to add to that computer science, period. So that instead of the 3, there would be 4. And I don't know, certainly the computer science people are going to know, but a lot of other people who teach are going to know how really unsure of themselves students are when they're faced with doing something with a computer other than browsing the internet. And our society is so headed so down such a technological road that this is a disservice to not have some standards that must be met in this field if we want to maintain any kind of edge in this country. So that is under discussion out there by various groups.
That's interesting.
Just
And
to
I
offer-
understand your point.
Just to offer a contrarian view, because I often do, I would be surprised that you wouldn't be ecstatic to have students delivered to you with a solid math foundation to work with. But I don't want to engage in a debate. We are not the math people. But so, right. So this is our one and only slide on math, so feel free to slide out the slide exits if you're just here for math and take a break. But we're going back to ELA as opposed to getting into a debate we can't carry our half of.
That's how it usually is. She moves me along.
To not move along just yet, are there assessments underway for sciences?
The standards, it's called Next Generation
Standards?
Science Standards. Those are, the first draft came out about 2 weeks ago. You can get it on the NSTE site. I don't think they've started working on the test yet, no, because judging, if we just interpolate from the Common Core standards, it wasn't until after, a few months after they were approved in June 2010 that the consortia were formed for the testing. So that hasn't started yet.
They are in their first draft of review, and from what we've heard, they're problematic because there's about 18 months worth of content crammed into every school year. So they need to be reviewed by people who know what they're doing. It's a whole separate group, and they are being written by committee, not 40 or 50 people, not by 3.
But having worked with science teachers around the country, what they include in those tests is really going to be important.
So this is probably a pretty easy question, actually. I'm just wondering about what we can expect the students to know in math when they come out of this set of standards. Would you say this is less calculus-centric, or do you have the answer to that?
Well, yeah, I know enough to know it's less calculus-centric.
Okay.
Because the focus is, theoretically, you come out of this ready for Algebra 1. That was what the debate was. The people who said that, well, you have to have Algebra 1 in 8th grade. So this is Algebra 1-centric, not pre-calculus-centric. Good question. We should move on, only because of time and because we don't know as much about math. Okay, your last short one was short and good, so you earned another one.
Will these Common Core standards be aligned with the ACT and the SAT?
That's an interesting question. I don't know how many of you saw last week that our group that was responsible for writing the standards is Student Achievement Partners. The founder of Student Achievement Partners, the man I mentioned, David Coleman, was named president of the College Board last week. So does that answer your question? You have 2 good short questions. All right, let's take a look at this. The ELA language shifts. Let's start with the bottom. Regular practice with complex text and academic language. This is a why. Why complex text? This is fascinating. American College Testing Service, ACT, did a study in 2006. They said, let's take a look at our test. Those kids, can we find a benchmark whereby students who scored above the benchmark did demonstrably better in college than students who scored below the benchmark? They found their benchmark. It was 21 out of 36 questions. Students who scored above 21 out of 36 were far more likely, statistically significant, to graduate college in 4 years and to get a B or better on their first 2 years humanities classes. Huge difference. So they took it a step further. How did those kids did better on the test, But what did they do better on? What kinds of questions did they do better on? So the first thing they looked at, which people in the literacy world look at all the time, is inferential questions versus literal questions. No difference. The kids who scored above the benchmark did not statistically significantly better than the kids below on literal versus inferential questions. So then they went beyond that. What about questions having to do with themes? Questions having to do with the validity of arguments? Questions having to do with an author's reasoning? Questions having to do with the sequence of a text? Questions having to do with an author's purpose? No difference. The types of questions made absolutely no difference. There was only one thing that discriminated those students who scored above the benchmark from those who scored below: the complexity of the text on the passages. The students who scored below the benchmark averaged, as an aggregate, 26 or 27% correct. Now, it's a multiple choice test. There's only 4 choices. You're getting pretty close to guessing when you're only getting 26 or 27% correct. On the most complex text, those students might as well have been reading Serbo-Croatian. They had no ability to deal with the most complex text. The single biggest predictor of success in college, based on this study, which had a sample size of 568,000 students, was the ability to read complex text. That in itself is interesting, because you're hearing this from 2 people who are involved in the standards. The American College Testing Service, they have standards. They had standards that look a lot like the standards that we just read: purpose, structure, theme, evidence, and so forth. But the standards didn't really matter. The complexity level of the text mattered. And that's why Standard 10 exists. Another reason, in a study done in the mid to late 1990s, which Meredith and I replicated recently, they looked at texts, the complexity level of text, beginning in 1961 and going to the end of the 1990s. And it turns out, and this study is in Appendix A of the standards, for anybody who wants to look at it. The complexity level of what 11th graders were reading in the late 1990s was equivalent to what 7th graders were reading in the early 1960s. 7th graders in the early 1960s were reading text of the same levels of complexity that our 11th graders were reading in the end of the 1990s. A third study, somebody actually did, some of you may have heard the old McGuffey reader, the original Basel readers. The old McGuffey reader in 6th grade was more complex than the average level of texts in high school. The complexity in the 6th grade McGuffey reader, which came into play in the late 19th century, was more complex on average than what we were asking our high school kids to read. Fourth, and this was also a study that Meredith and I replicated, it was originally done by Hayes and Wolfer, it's cited in Appendix A. We took the complexity level of 12th grade texts, 11th and 12th grade texts, across the country. This doesn't count AP, because AP is not a high school text. It's supposed to be a college text. And we compared that to what was read in college and career, in freshman classes in college, community college, senior colleges across the country, and career training manuals, post office manuals, military manuals. The difference in complexity was 4 years. We were asking our kids to jump 4 years in the complexity of what they were asked to read, going from 12th grade to college and career. That is partly why so many kids are in remedial reading classes in college, even though the statistics, and this was one of the things that, one of the pieces of evidence behind the standards, even though I forget the number, some huge percentage of those kids who go into remedial reading and writing classes never graduate anyway. I think it's like a $12 billion that is spent yearly on those programs, and those kids don't graduate from 4-year colleges. the increase in complexity from the end of high school to college is enormous. You're asking kids to make a 4-year jump. So that's why complexity is a standard. That's why kids beginning in 3rd grade are going to be asked to read much more complex texts than they've been reading all along. They're going to need support to do that, and we're going to talk about that, but they're going to be asked to read more complex text. Reading and writing grounded in evidence from the text. The standards emphasize evidence, evidence, evidence. What this means is not only the questions that are going to be asked of kids when they read books and they read short texts is going to be about what's in the text and what's the evidence and how can you prove it. This doesn't sound that controversial, but if you're familiar with K-12 education, much of the questions that kids are asked to address in K-12 education are your personal response to a text. What would you do in this situation? How do you feel about this? Do you know someone who had a similar experience? That is no longer in the Common Core standards. That's not a standard. So if you ask kids how they respond personally to a text, then you're not aligned with the standard. Now, doesn't that sound kind of mean? You can't have a personal response to a text. Many of our questions that we've been dealing with, K-12, are about personal responses to text. Well, of course you can. You have to. If you're reading a text about an older brother who got killed in Afghanistan and you've got kids who've got older siblings in Afghanistan, how can you not address that with those kids? But you address it after the text is thoroughly analyzed. Because what happens in K-12 education is so much time gets spent on each child's experience with that text and what they want to share that there's no time to actually analyze the text. This is true from kindergarten to 12th grade. So what we're saying is analyze the text thoroughly. Yes, that's all that's going to be tested, but that you certainly should, once the text is thoroughly analyzed, bring in the response of those students who have a personal connection or who want to share a personal connection to that text and to the theme or content of that text. That does two things. If they've analyzed the text thoroughly first, their personal connection is going to mean more than if they just stop in the middle, which is how it's usually done. Number two, talking about your personal experiences, whether it's 3rd graders reading a text on bats that want to talk about when their father accidentally flushed the bat down the toilet, or whether it's 9th graders who want to talk about their brother in the war, it's a little easier for all of us to talk about personal experiences than to analyze text. If you leave it until the end, the only kids who are really going to want to do it are those who have a deep and true personal connection. Very often, if you do it during the analysis of the text, kids want to do it because it's easier than analyzing a text. So that's why the Common Core standards put this emphasis on evidence, evidence, evidence. Standard 1. Standard 1 and Standard 10 are by far the most important standards. Standard 1 is the evidence standard for reading and writing. Standard 10 is the complexity standard. If you can answer all kinds of questions about the development of an argument, about how an author structured his theme, and whether or not he was successful. If you're in the 10th grade and you're reading a text that is 8th grade, you've met no standards. You've met no 10th grade standards at all. Even if you understand the ideas of developing of a theme, or author's purpose, or structure of a text, you have to be able to demonstrate that understanding with 10th grade level text complexity. And that's a huge shift. Yes?
So I tend to be a deliberative thinker, and I'm not good at taking time tests. So I would probably fail these.
The tests are probably, we don't have any inside information, but in the world of psychometricians, which I sometimes refer to as the psycho world, in the world of psychometricians, these tests will probably be 1.5. They'll make an estimate of how much time a student should spend on a test like this, and then add half of that time and allow it. So if they think it's a test that most children should do in 60 minutes, they'll provide 90 minutes. I think that's the way they're going.
They're also going to break it into different parts of the year. There's a possibility there may be 2 or 3 through tests that together compile into the year-end score. Because to test research, they're going to do multi-day tests. They have to. A kid's ability to do short, intense research. So I think all those questions are still being wrestled with.
Good question. Yes?
The
The question was more about testing research and how it'll fit into it.
Right. We don't know. We know that they're wrestling with it right now in the 2 consortia. We don't know much about that internal wrestling. It's pretty.
Well, we know about the standards, though. The standards call for short research. It's not.
Yeah. And the standards call for taking time. I mean, there's a huge emphasis to slow down and take time. So
that part of the test may be much longer. It's probably going to be where they read one text about something, answer some questions, and then are required to go online and find some information related to the text they just read and relate that text, and it's probably going to be a morning or something like that. These tests are called the next generation tests, and they're really going to be different than just A, B, C, D. Well, the standards talk about research, but they don't.
Summarize the question.
The question was if there's going to be an explicit building into the standards and more explication on informational text. Informational literacy. The standards have gone about as far as they can with that. The informational text is another huge shift in the standards. 50% of what kids read in elementary school has to be nonfiction or informational text. 55% in middle school and 70% in high school. What the student reads, the totality of the students reading in high school is supposed to be 70% informational text. That's the shift that we're talking about. So what the standards did is the standards said you have to read much more informational text. Why? That's what you read in college, and that's what you read in Korea. You don't read that many stories anymore in college, and you don't read that many stories anymore in Korea.
In terms of informational literacy, they definitely point the way to the importance of the librarian, but they're not explicit about it. But I think any school system thinking seriously about implementation had better be thinking seriously about how to bring the librarian into the center of that conversation.
I guess I'm following up a little bit on the idea of testing and the fact that you're still putting kids in a position of, here's how you have to perform on this day. You're still putting teachers in the position of teaching to a test. And I haven't heard a whole lot about the things that 21st century learning is looking at in where is they're teaching kids from kindergarten on up, how to learn, how to be self-directed, how to be motivated, and therefore be problem solvers. So I have a little problem when you say reflection is not a good thing, where at higher ed we're in a world where we're promoting more and more reflection, because I really do think that even 5-year-olds can learn a lot more from asking the why, reflecting, and going back on what they have in their experiences to draw from. I still see here where a kid, as a different learner especially, when you say something like Ken Burns is secondary to a written text for a visual learner, that's not necessarily the case at all. And they can get just as much learning out of Ken Burns without it having to be enhancement. And I see this still as a move in the direction of the failure of No Child Left Behind. It just means that it's across 46 states and is all the same, as opposed to different state by state.
Well, I told you it's good to have questions where you disagree. That was 3 or 4 different parts, and not necessarily in the order you asked it. The standards don't abolish reflection. They require reflection on the text, not reflection on your private reaction to the text. And that's the difference. That doesn't mean that your private reaction to the text isn't valid. The standards can't cover everything in the universe of education. They're requiring a reflection on a test. The the last anchor standard was on standard 1. The evidence standard was to be able to determine what the text says explicitly, as well as what can be inferred from the text, as well as what the text might leave uncertain. That's very close to a reflection. So the standards ask for reflection, but they ask for text-based reflection, which is different from personal reflection. And again, that doesn't mean that they shouldn't exist. The other part, in terms of 21st century skills, the standards are just that, standards. They state what a child should be able to do at each grade level. They do not tell you how to do that. If you take a text and you're supposed to be able to evaluate the sufficiency and validity of an author's argument, that text might be on a screen, that text might be on a piece of paper. It doesn't tell you how to teach that. That text might be part of a unit on Reconstruction. And you might have seen some videos on Reconstruction. You might have had some small group work on Reconstruction. You might have had some debates on Reconstruction. You might have read some primary sources on Reconstruction. All the standards say is that you should be able to read a text on Reconstruction of sufficient complexity on your own and evaluate the argument based on these standards. Not how much of the instruction should have been multimedia, how much of the instruction should have been small group, how much of the instruction should have been whole group. Standards don't dictate the how. They dictate the what. The test question doesn't dictate the how. The text question dictates the what. On a test, and these tests are going to be very different, you have to answer a question that reflects these standards. And then the test reflects the standards, and in the case of the test, might include multimedia. In fact, it will have to include some multimedia because Standard 7 is a multimedia standard. So, for example, the research piece that you mentioned might have a topic. Students might give them a topic on global warming. They read a text on global warming. They look at some multimedia research on global warming, and they have to analyze compare and contrast the multimedia standard on global warming with the text standard at current levels, at appropriate levels of complexity on global warming. So there's a multimedia standard. So therefore, that has to be tested just as much as any other standard.
It is also but they're literacy and math standards, this suite. They're not learning standards. So they're not going to stretch beyond that as well. Some of your other learning style things it would be inappropriate for these to point to those, to have opinions on those or to have standards on those because they're not learning standards. They're literacy and then mathematics standards.
And I would urge you to look up Project Zero, Howard Gardner's organization at Harvard, that did the final study on different styles of learning, and a recent study by Stephen Stahl, S-T-A-H-L, that in fact they don't hold water when they're actually tested.
I want to say I applaud what you're doing. I think it's a great step, but I'm also concerned that English language arts ought to also be about being able to study and interpret things for which there are no correct answers. How does one interpret a work of literature? How does one interpret a work of poetry? How does one think through philosophical questions where there isn't a matter of there's evidence of this or that or the other thing? There really is room for different interpretations.
It's a very good question. You're addressing the author's interpretations. If an author makes a point about what is the nature of science, does science move forward on the basis of the discovery of new facts, or does science move forward on the basis of new theories? And an author states his position on those two things, and you're analyzing what he says. There's still analysis, if I understand your question, but the standards don't highlight interpretation. They highlight analysis of what an author states in the text.
But they are very stern on evidence. Standard 1 is an evidence standard. And the other thing that's interesting about these, and I think pertinent in this room, is that these are college and career readiness standards. So there is a sternness about them and a slimness about them that is fairly relentless on that point. And again, I would just, there's 46 standards, 10 reading, 10 writing, 6 speaking, and 6 listening standards. So whatever that adds up to in total. And then there's language standards for also. There's very few of these, and the reason there aren't 150 per grade, that we were rescuing teachers and students from that, is because we were very stern about saying, would you keep a child in school if they did not have this? That was always the driving question. So we felt we would not keep a child in school if they could not do literary analysis of ambiguous text to a great, that was not a showstopper. They could go live productive lives if they couldn't do that. And if they loved that, they could go to college into your arms, ready and skilled, and you could do it with them. So there's definitely a sternness and a leanness about these that I'm actually very pleased with. It's the only set of standards I've ever even been remotely fond of, because they're so lean, stern, and limited. They're very disciplined about being limited in their scope. And I think it's interesting how many questions are about what they aren't and why didn't they do this. They didn't do that because of that self-discipline and intense focus. So for me as a K-12 person, there's reason to celebrate in that. And as a CCV instructor, when I have time, there's also reason to celebrate that I might start getting kids delivered ready to do this other work in your care. So we're here to tell you what the standards are. It's interesting to speculate on what they're not, but I think we should keep telling you what they are so you have a little bit of exposure.
Let's take a look at how this is played out in classrooms, because I think this will flush out some of these ideas that we've been talking about. We've been going around the country as schools make this kind of shift to evidence, complex text, and how that might work. This is something that came from, we just got it, from a group called the Paideia group, that is kind of like the Great Books organization. And they read classic pieces of literature, and they're adjusting their program to fit with the Common Core standards. So they have a very complex text from On the Nature of Things, 54 BC, by Lucretius. Now mark me, and I'm reading from that. Now mark me, since I have taught that things cannot be born from nothing, cannot when begotten be brought back to nothing, that you may not happily yet begin in any shape to mistrust my words, because the first beginning of things cannot be seen by the eyes. Take moreover this list of bodies, which you must yourself admit are in the number of things and cannot be seen. First of all, the force of the wind, when aroused, beats on the harbors and whelms huge ships and scatters clouds. Sometimes in swift whirling eddy, it scours the plains and straws them with large trees and scourges the mountain summits with forest-rending blasts. So fiercely does the wind rave with a shrill howling and rage, with threatening roar. Winds, therefore, sure enough, are unseen bodies which sweep the seas, the lands, and the clouds of heaven, tormenting them and catching them up in sudden whirls. Now, this is designed for 6th to 8th grade, and it has questions along the lines of, opening question, what word or phrase from the text do you think is most important? Why did you choose that word or phrase? So that would be evidence. In sentences 2 to 6, Lucretius uses the wind as an example of things that cannot be seen. Based on the text, why do you think he chose the wind? In sentence 6, Lucretius writes that the winds are found to rival great rivers, which are of a visible body. Why do you think he compares something invisible, the wind, to something visible, water? So you have a series of what we call evidence-based or text-based questions on a very complex text. When these students first get the text, you know what they're asked to do? They're asked to number each sentence. So they read it, and they locate where each sentence ends and where the next sentence begins. So they have 1, 2, 3, 4. They are then asked a series of intensive questions, grades 6 to 8, on this very complex text. That's grades 6 to 8. But it can begin a little earlier. Here's one from Vermont, and it's a poem for 1st grade that is read aloud to the students. Because in 1st grade and kindergarten and 2nd grade, many of these standards are met by read aloud. We want read aloud to be, for the students across the country in K1 and 2, what educated parents do for their kids. Educated parents read aloud sophisticated text to their kids right away. We're trying to bring that into K-2. So here's a poem on the wind. I can get through a doorway without, and it's read to the students, but they're not told the title. I can get through a doorway without any key and strip the leaves from the great oak tree. I can drive storm clouds and shake tall towers, or steal through a garden and not wake the flowers. Seas I can move and ships I can sink. I can carry a housetop or the scent of a pink. When I am angry, I can rave and riot. And when I am spent, I lie, quiet as quiet. Now, this class spent a whole week analyzing this poem. And as an example of one of the questions, sometimes the authors of poems put sentences together differently than we usually do. What would be the usual way of saying, seas I can move? How about ships I can sink? Why do you think James Reeves, the author, chose to change the order of the words? What could move seas and sink ships? Is there anything we should remove from our list? They began by, after having it read three times, they made a list of, what is this? They made guesses. And then after each question, they would see if they could remove anything from the list. So this is a poem of roughly 8 lines, with some sophisticated vocabulary and some sophisticated syntax. And the children spent a week on it. Well, if you start that in 1st grade, then when you get to 6th grade and you read Lucretius that I just read to you, it's not going to be that hard. If you're analyzing text and evidence-based questions carefully, you're looking at what role does a sentence play? What if I took this word out and put another word in? One of the questions on Lucretius was also, which is the most important word in the first paragraph and why? Can you think of another word you would put in instead, and how would that change the meaning of the text? This is 6th graders. So this is what we call close reading. It's a way to support all students in reading complex text. The way it's done is through multiple readings. The students hear it read aloud. If they're older, they follow along. If they're in 1st grade, they listen 2, 3, or 4 times. Then they dissect it, section by section by section. Paragraph, word, sentence level. Vocabulary that can be determined from context, we ask them to determine from context in groups. Everything is done in groups. Otherwise, the kids would make you crazy. They do it in groups. They think about it. They talk about it. They write about it. They reread it. They think. They talk. They write. Some vocabulary is given to them beforehand. Other vocabulary they have to determine from context. Everybody is there, the weakest readers and the strongest readers. What we've done in our country to date is we differentiate instruction through ability grouping. We don't call it ability grouping. It's like the high school I went to right here in Vermont. Well, we don't do ability grouping. Well, how do they choose their classes in the 11th grade? Well, they have a choice. They can do Shakespeare, they can do literature of the Holocaust, or they can do hunting stories. Oh, that's not ability grouping. So we make sure that the weakest kids never get exposed to complex text. And that's why a study that came out just this past summer at the American Educational Research Association showed that 3rd grade students who were behind in reading were 90% more likely to drop out of high school than 3rd grade students who were not behind in reading. Those students were never exposed to this level of rich, beautiful, complex text. They were leveled to death. Dumbed down text 1st grade, dumbed down text 2nd grade, dumbed down text 3rd grade. We differentiate instruction through the text rather than through providing support so that everybody can get this. It's not the only thing kids read. Kids have to do a volume of reading. They have to read stories. They have to read things they like, and those are going to have to be at their level. And that they should do. The more they read, the better. But they also should be exposed on a regular basis to beautiful, complex text. So that when you get kids coming to you as freshmen in college, the goal is that they will have had this kind of experience. One of the first ones we did was the Gettysburg Address, which has been now doing all over the country. And the Gettysburg Address is 287 words. We recommend it be studied for a week for a week in a traditional high school class, 50 minutes, 5 days. And we've been doing that, and we went to one of the first classes that did it, which was a 9th and 10th grade class in Queens, New York. Queens, New York is the home of the New York Mets and more nationalities than any place on earth. So the class was about half kids who didn't come here speaking English. And they spent one whole week on the Gettysburg Address, and then they filled out a response to how they felt about it, because frankly, we were a little worried that their response would be that they were going to call 911 next time this happened. But they responded really positively. And one kid said something that stayed with me, that'll always stay with me. He said, first of all, he began by saying, this is interesting. Now, when you get a 9th grader to use the word interesting, that in itself is a moral victory equivalent to the fall of the Berlin Wall. But he then said, this is interesting. We usually just read these things once and then make a whole bunch of assumptions. Now, what was he saying? Usually we read the thing once and then everybody talks about what they think about it and what they feel about it, and a whole bunch of things that might not be connected to the text. Similar, a 5th grade class, not doing Gettysburg, thank goodness, but a 5th grade class reading a piece written by the theoretical physicist Richard Feynman, a biographical piece on his relationship with his father. Also, 1 week on a 3-page article from Cricket magazine. And this was a 5th grade EL class, so they were all English language learners. When they finished this text, they clapped. Now, they didn't clap because they were enamored with theoretical physics. They clapped because they knew that they accomplished something. The text was really hard. It's usually used in middle school, 6 to 8. On Common Core levels of complexity, it's a 5th grade text. They clapped when they finished it. We're afraid to challenge kids. We're afraid to put something in front of kids and make them wrestle with it. And if you don't wrestle with something, then you're never going to get to appreciate it as much, and you're never going to get as good at it as you should. And that's a huge part of these Common Core standards, to put beautiful, rich, complex text in front of kids on a regular basis and have them deeply wrestle with what that text has to say. And not to deny personal response, but put the personal response after the text is completely analyzed. When we do these lessons, a lot of the extension activities have to do with personal response. But the text has been thoroughly analyzed at that point. That's the heart of the literacy standards, putting in front of kids complex text, beautiful text that they can analyze deeply and spend a lot of time on, and so that at the end they know they've succeeded. Okay. Questions or comments on that? Minimal music and art standards or competencies? Probably not. We're not even going to have history standards, right? Because we're too crazy. So I don't think we'll ever have standards in music and art. Something, though, that's important. There was a research study done also by Howard Gardner at Project Zero. It's very interesting. When No Child Left Behind came out, a lot of music and art classes got cut, right? And so they did a study to show that it increased, that if you cut those, it'll decrease reading scores. It turns out that their study showed that it didn't have any effect on reading scores, but the problem was they looked at 1 year. The more you know about the world, the better a reader you are. If you don't know anything about music and art over the course of your 13 years in K-12 education, you're not going to be a proficient reader, because knowledge is a prerequisite of reading. So I think that's as much as we're going to get. I don't think we're going to ever have standards for music and art.
Thank you. My question is about the standards as a whole, not just literacy. Several of us in this room attended a presentation on Common Core state standards a while back, and I think that we all got the message that in the interests of depth, that
in the interest of depth?
In the interests of depth, a particularly important vehicle was going to be integrated project-based learning and inquiry-based learning. And given your emphasis on close reading and textual analysis, I guess I want to ask you for your viewpoint. Will toward the student mastery of Common Core standards, will project-based learning likely prove a significant vehicle?
We're tracking alignment and early implementation efforts all over the place, and I would say yes. There are some really, really beautiful cross-curricular, in-depth, extended study units being developed, because the other gift that this will hopefully deliver is less is more, both in the math and in the literacy ELA standards. So my hope is yes. There's going to be unintended consequences and bad things happening in the names of these standards as big districts try to interpret them. So we have concerns, but my hope is that there's every bit of room for that. But there is this accountability. There's as I keep using the word stern. These standards are stern about what they want kids to do and be able to prove at the end of the day. So those would have to be tight and accountable, at the teacher and student level, I would say, to be fully aligned.
I asked that question because student practice along those lines at K through 12 levels will be particularly important for what we would like to do with our students once they come to college.
I think that it's important to understand the standards. Close reading is a way to get complex text. Complex text is the biggest change in these standards. Close reading is a way to get complex text. It's not the only way to meet these standards. States and districts are developing units of instruction with essential questions. So you'll have a unit on the Civil War. You'll have a unit on the history of science. You'll have a unit on the development of computers. And then it'll have a certain number of texts. Some of those texts might be read closely. Others are read not quite as closely, but still supported. So the standards don't knock out project-based learning, certainly not in anything, in ELA, math, or science. Other questions?
I guess I have a clarification. My understanding with the work that I've, been trained by you, was that this was not the entire curriculum, that these were standards that were embedded in the rest of the curriculum, and it's not like all the English teachers are just going to be working on these standards, but it's going to be a joint effort of
other teachers.
Of the other teachers. And it's not going to be the only curriculum. It's not like the Common Core that sort of defined the entire K-12 curriculum, but it's looking at critical skills within the curriculum.
These standards are, as you say, they're designed, that's why there's standards for reading in science, standards for reading in social studies, which we've never had. At the K-12 level, it'll be interesting how you respond to this. In the K-12 level, reading in science and reading in social studies is very often answer questions 3, 9, and 4, and the kids skim the book until they find that section of the text that answers 3, 9, and 4. And if they're fairly verbal, they paraphrase it. And if they're not fairly verbal, they just copy it word for word. These standards are designed to wipe that out. Because, in a way, it's using the text for a good purpose. 70% of the questions on the high school text are going to be about science or social studies. If all you're doing in science and social studies is skimming and paraphrasing the answers to questions, then you're not going to be able to meet the demands of these standards. And that is how I work in high schools around the country, and there are many places in 9th and 10th grade, until the kids go to honors 11th grade classes or AP, it's all hands-on. They don't read anything in science. And then we talk at the same time about making them lifelong learners where they're not reading anything in science, which has got to make it a little more difficult when they go to college. But they are designed across the board. That's important. 5 minutes left. Let's just take one more question.
I'm wondering, as I hear this presentation, I think that, so the implementation is 2014, so I think how fortunate to be a kindergartner in 2014, right? What about the students who this is implemented on, who are in 6th, 7th, 8th grade? What thinking has gone into how to support them?
Right, it's a good question. It's harder to catch up.
Good segue to your next slide.
Okay. Will this work? You may be shocked, but sometimes things fail in education. Will this work? It's possible that there's a number. I think it's really good to ask why something might not work. I think you really learn a lot from that. One is exactly what you're saying, that the kindergarten kids, and to some extent the early ed, first, second, and third, are going to get the benefit of this, but can we make it up with 9th, 10th, and 11th, and 12th graders who didn't have these kinds of demands put on them? We might not be able to. That's absolutely the case. We might not be able to. It is, when you're very far behind in reading and writing in the 9th grade, even in the 7th grade, but in the it's really hard to catch up. And that may be one reason why this doesn't work. Another reason why this doesn't work, this is a perfect storm for our nation's K-12 teachers. Look what's happening all at the same time. Number one, they're being held more accountable than they ever have before because of the accountability movement. Number two, there's cuts everywhere. Class size is increasing. Specials in art and science and other areas are sometimes being eliminated. And number three, they've got these new standards coming in. So you could look at this as a perfect storm. I would hope it would be a perfect opportunity. But hope doesn't always work. That's another way that these standards might fail. A third way they might fail, and this connects to a bunch of your questions, is just the things we're talking about will not do it. Kids have to still read a lot and write a lot. If they don't read a lot, their vocabulary won't grow. If they don't write a lot, they'll never be fluent in vocabulary. There are many other things besides these new standards that have to keep up. Let's take a look at what is the role of higher ed. Education departments, I think there's clear implications for teachers in schools of education to take a look at what you're doing with your future teachers in terms of reading and writing, and also in terms of math. Are you teaching your students how to teach students to deal with this level of complexity on a regular basis, and to read science and read social studies? The content knowledge about reading has to be increased in schools of education. People come out of schools of education often knowing much less than they should about reading across the board, especially with older students and how to help older students. Everyone else, our experience in teaching at CCV was we gave kids something called a structured journal. And that came from looking at CCV and saying, well, we got these kids for 3 hours. And if they don't do the assignments, it's going to be a very dull class if I'm lecturing for 3 hours, or if I'm showing a video for 1 and lecturing for 2. How can I make sure that they've done the reading I want them to do? What I did in my work at CCV, and Meredith very similar, we created an approach called a structured journal. For everything the kids had to read, they had to address 4 points. What was important about what I read? And we divided it into sections, like let's say 10 pages at a time or 5. What was important? What didn't I understand? What didn't I get? How can I connect this to what I'm learning in this class? And what reflections do I have about what is said here? And the students had to do that on their own. It's a shift. When you give kids a question, you're scaffolding in a way. You're telling them what's important. When you put this kind of structured journal on them, they have to determine what's important. We found our kids really wrestled with this. But there were many of them, some could not do it. I think they couldn't do it because they couldn't read the text, the complexity of the text that we were using. Others had to struggle, and Meredith and I both had to work on distinguishing the can'ts from the won'ts, and supporting the can'ts and doing whatever we had to do for the won'ts, who often just failed.
And
it was
I would
putting
argue-
response. Go ahead.
I would argue that's sort of a paradigm shift for all of us, because I think all of us in our teaching selves have sort of a belief that everybody can't do something, and then we act a certain set of ways. Or others of us get to a point in our careers where we think, well, they just won't do it, these kids, and then that leads to a certain other set of beliefs and actions. And I think a singular challenge for all of us is to figure that out. And because the supports and the actions have to be different for those two groups of students. because students who are really genuinely struggling to read deeply, whether they're in third grade or whether they're 30-year-olds coming back to class, need to be worked with in really set, supportive ways. And sometimes I think of close reading, the metaphor for that is that the teacher's staying close. The teacher's really an active coach in that process, providing the scaffolds and the questions in a way we didn't get to move into during today, but we do have a follow-up session where we can drill down on lots of these things for people who are interested.
Okay, thank you very much.